Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I think people are coming in, so we're going to give a little bit of time so that participants can join us. Good afternoon to the ones that are joining. I see people coming in. Let's give another few seconds. Yeah, very good. Excellent. All right. I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online policy dialogue on climate change, nationalism, and the state, a realist approach. This event today is jointly organized by the European Policy Center and by the King Baudouin Foundation under its Connecting for Climate initiative. For those that don't know me, my name is Ricardo Borges de Castro. I'm the Associate Director and Head of Europe in the World Program here at the EPC. Today's event happens at the moment where the world has received basically code red from the United Nations. The latest IPCC report on climate change says that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. So really, we are at a moment where all actions and all ideas that can be brought to the table to discuss how to tackle this issue are important. We are also a short few days away from COP26. So this is the right moment, and we thought both the European Policy Center and the King Baudouin Foundation that this was really a moment, or we are at a moment that all ideas, all views should be discussed, should be debated as a contribution to fight climate change. So today I'm really delighted to be joined by a stellar panel of speakers to discuss climate change, nationalism, and the role of the nation state in fighting it. So first, I'd like to welcome Anatol Lieven. He's a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft at Washington, D.C. And he's also the author of Climate Change and the Nation State, the Realist Perspective. This is I believe, the European title of the book. I find that the American version is a more suggestive title, which says The Case for Nationalism in a Warming World. So this is the subtitle of the book. So I thought that I would bring this up because I believe that this issue is going to be relevant for our discussion. So welcome, Anatol. I'm also joined by Hedberg Grabbe. She's director of Open Society European Policy Institute here in Brussels, and Heather is doing a lot of work on climate change, has I know a personal and professional concern about this topic. So we are really delighted to have you with us. And last but not least, we have our own EPC, Annika Hedberg, who's the head of Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program here at the EPC. And I know that Annika spends a lot of time thinking about, not only climate change, but sustainability and the issues that, of course, are related to global warming and also, to environmental degradation and biodiversity. So she spends a lot of her time thinking about this. So I think we have a really good group of speakers to help us think through these problems. And then before I pass the floor to Anatol, I just wanted to give a little bit of housekeeping rules for everybody. So our session will last 75 minutes. We will start with remarks by Anatol. He will have up to 25 minutes to put forth his argument, his ideas, and then I'll call Heather and Annika to respond to Anatol's views. And then we will have a short conversation among ourselves, and then I will bring the audience to the screen. So I'd like to ask you to, if you want, you can start right away writing your questions in the Q&A box. Do them shortly so I can read them at a glance. Or if you actually want to be part of the screen, just raise your hand, and I'll ask my colleagues to really give you the floor, and that you can speak. So Anatol, welcome. Since you published your book, there's been a lot of interest about this book. I think more than 165 persons signed up registered for today's event, And I think that in a town that hosts probably the most successful international regional organization that combines, intergovernmental and supranational features, I think your ideas are very interesting. And so we are really looking forward to listening to you. So I'll give you the screen, Anatol. Please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak at this forum. Yes, well, sort of briefly to describe my book, it's not about the science of climate change. I take the science of climate change as a given. Frankly, I think that it would be completely irrational and, different from our approach or a sensible approach to any other issue to doubt the basic scientific analysis of climate change as expressed, by the scientific consensus through the IPCC. So my book is really about what to do about climate change, but most importantly, how to mobilize elite and public support for radical action against climate change. First and foremost, of course, in the Western democracies, and the book does, of course, have a particular argument directed at the United States, but also more widely, because, of course, we must recognize that while countries in Asia are not, of course, in any way historically responsible for this problem. I mean, that is very much us. China is now the largest emitter, and also together with India, the country where emissions are rising most rapidly now. So my book stems from two propositions, both of which I think are generally accepted, though not necessarily followed through is the problem. The first, and I'd make this case very strongly to the international security community, or the Western security community from which I myself stem, is that climate change is the greatest threat, not only to humanity in general over the next century and more, but also specifically to our Western countries. And here, once again, I speak as a realist with regarding the interests of states, and of course the populations of those states, as the principal element in international affairs. The second proposition, which I fear probably we would all have to agree with, is that so far and at present, we are failing adequately to reduce emissions, at least if the warnings of the IPCC are accurate, then we are failing. And if present trajectories continue, then temperatures will rise by more than 3 degrees by the end of this century. Now, of course, this will not only lead to, if it happens, God forbid, to an intensification of the damage that we already see happening. I mean, this is not theoretical. We see already, the wildfires, heat waves, increased flooding, and very definite, though early, signs of the desertification of the entire Mediterranean region, everything that would mean for the future of Europe, and of course North Africa as well. But of course, as we also all know, there is a real, though naturally not quantifiable, risk of tipping points and feedback loops, whereby 3 degrees will turn into 4 degrees, 4 degrees into 5 degrees. And at that point, modern civilization will collapse if this happens over a fairly short space of time, even the space of a few decades. There is even, a certain possibility of the end of humanity itself. And it should be noted in this regard that because they are based on consensuses, the warnings of the IPCC, perhaps they are exaggerated, but perhaps they are actually considerably too restrained and moderate in this regard. So we have truly dire threats to humanity in general, but also to our countries. Now, in this regard, it must also be noted that while physical threats that threaten the very existence of states, that threaten state collapse and social meltdown, will not occur directly to the West in the next few generations. Probably, can't say for sure, of course. They will occur in other parts of the world. Other parts of the world where temperatures are already not too far off from the limits of human survivability or work outside. In summer, I would direct people's attention to reports by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, amongst other places, which warn of this in South Asia, in the Persian Gulf, where there is already severe levels of water stress. And also, of course, where states are simply weaker and poorer and are suffering from a range of other issues. Because, as has often been remarked, as the Pentagon itself has noted, climate change can act not just through its direct effects, but also as a threat multiplier. It can exacerbate other existing problems, conflicts over access to water of the kind we see in a number of different places in Africa. A rise in food prices leading to mass discontent, leading to rebellion and civil war, as we saw in Syria, and so forth and so on. Now, among these vulnerable countries, where the effects of climate change will become dire, or the indirect effects on society will become dire, not in the next century, but already by the middle of this century, are to be numbered India and the other countries of South Asia, where, of course, more than a quarter of the world's population lives, and Western Africa, including Nigeria, which it is estimated will have a population of around 400 million people by the middle of this century. So we are talking about, elsewhere in the world, existential threats to states and societies which, if we do not act radically to limit climate change, will kick in, while certainly younger people alive today will still be alive, possibly not even old, only middle-aged. So, this is not some theoretical distant danger. And as far as Western societies are concerned, I mean, there will, of course, be very unpleasant direct effects. They're already happening. They will get worse. But there will also be massive indirect effects. And here, I have to say, we have to identify migration. But of course, not necessarily migration itself, but migration and the reaction against migration in our own societies as a really dire threat to Western liberal democracy. Once again, not next century, but in the decades to come. And just as we can see wildfires, we can see water shortages, heat waves, floods happening today. So I'm afraid there is simply no excuse for ignoring the threat of migration, or once again, reaction against migration to liberal democracy in our countries. We know this from the opinion polls, which have helped to explain support for Trump in the United States. And we know this from the rise of radical right parties in Europe, the role of migration in driving this. And there it seems to me, be no doubt that if you look at places from which migration is already occurring, and you look at the reasons for migration in terms of poverty, water shortages, state dysfunction, social violence of various kinds, there can be no reasonable doubt that climate change is going to make this worse, perhaps radically worse, in the decades to come. So we are facing a range of dire threats, direct threats to Western societies in the further future, indirect threats in what by historical standards is actually the very near future. Now, once again, I mean, all of this is recognized, if you like, formally. But I have to say, once again, as somebody who comes from the world of security studies, so much of this on the part of security establishments is basically box ticking. If less so in Europe, of course, But if you take the principal security organization for which, in which Western and Central European democracies are engaged, namely NATO, it would be very hard to argue that NATO has truly prioritized climate change, as a security threat to the West. In America, of course, still less so. And it is very striking in the United States that as soon as the Biden administration began to talk of climate change as an existential threat, there was an absolute chorus of voices, again, not from the Republicans, but from Democratic security experts saying, oh, well, yes, this may be true in perhaps in theory at some point in future, but actually we must not allow this to distract us from the true threat of China and Russia. And this is what we should really go on concentrating on. And above all, there should be absolutely no question of making concessions to China or Russia on any issue in order to gain extra action from them against climate change. Now, this does not reflect prioritization of climate change as a threat. A priority, the very word priority, means something comes first. By definition, that means something else comes second. But I have to say in this regard that it's not only our security elites who have, I would say, inherited from the past a set of attitudes that makes them incapable of truly prioritizing climate change. But reading the program of the German Greens, where they want to combine supposedly international cooperation on climate change with this very, very strong language of international human rights and democracy, which of course are directed against the existing states in China and Russia. And certainly do not help when it comes to trying to gain Chinese cooperation against climate change. And also, of course, I do not say that this is the agenda of the Greens, but it most certainly is the agenda of the hardest line American imperialists when it comes to international geopolitics. And they, of course, don't give a damn about climate change. In many cases, don't believe that it exists, and certainly would never for one moment accept that the threat of climate change takes priority over classical security threats. I like, in this regard, to point to one issue in particular, which is these so-called islands. They're not actually islands, they're reefs and sandbanks in the South China Sea that obsess. Well, of course, I mean, first and foremost, it was extremely stupid, deeply criminally stupid of the Chinese to build military bases on these places. But I have to say, the Vietnamese are no better. We ignore, the other people involved in these claims. But in my view, the American security establishment has also been deeply foolish to treat this as, some kind of really serious international threat, for the simple reason that not just if we fail, to keep climate change below 3 degrees, but even most probably at 2 degrees, all these places will be underwater again in 100 years' time. The issue will quite literally not exist. Or at the very least, they will be subject to such repeated flooding that, well, if the Chinese want to pour billions and billions and billions of dollars and millions of tons of concrete into the South China Sea, I suppose it's their business, really. Go ahead as far as I'm concerned. Or rather don't, because it's also a distraction from their action against climate change. But, anyway, through the prism of climate change, so many of the things that we worry about today are virtually irrelevant. And China, still more Russia, do not threaten to destroy our states. They don't even threaten to destroy our democracies. Insofar as authoritarianism is a threat to our democracies, it is because of the internal weakness of our democracies. And so in my book, I try to create an argument for how to strengthen our democracies more widely, but in the process, of course, also to mobilize sufficient mass democratic support for radical action against climate change, which in my view, this is of course, particularly true in the United States, but to a lesser extent in Europe as well, has to involve the creation of cross-party coalitions and has to involve winning over considerable numbers of conservative voters, at least conservative with a small c. And the reason for this is that it seems to me, but I believe this is, very well supported. We have to recognize that radical action against climate change will require very considerable sacrifices. The notion which is current on the left that, oh, this is only, a matter of a few corporations and it can be, easily solved by attacks on capitalism. No, we are all implicated in this, I too, my consumption patterns. Things will have to change and major sacrifices are necessary. And unfortunately, as we have seen, especially in the United States, but elsewhere as well, in Australia, in Europe, whenever populations have been faced with a clear request or demand to make sacrifices for the struggle against climate change, most of them have said no, or at least you have had enough people saying no to cripple the effort. Now, one answer to this, of course, is the Green New Deal. So the phrase that sums up this approach, and my book is written in very strong support of the Green New Deal idea, which is, of course, to combine radical action to limit emissions with measures of social solidarity and job creation, and to a degree, reindustrialization in a green fashion. This, I think, the need for this is best demonstrated of all in the case of France. I, of course, strongly supported President Macron's fuel tax. But to combine this with tax cuts for the rich and without a major program and rhetoric of social solidarity and common sacrifice was politically deeply stupid and led to the result we saw, the revolt of the Yellow Vests and a considerable setback for environmental policies in France. So social solidarity is a necessity. But I would say as well, when it comes to the motivation of sacrifice, and here I come to the most controversial aspect of my book, that we do need to mobilize nationalism, or to give it a nicer sounding phrase, but for me, patriotism and civic nationalism, obviously not ethnic nationalism, God forbid, are in effect the same thing, in the service of the struggle against climate change by focusing the attention of people and elites on the specific threat to their states and our states, to our countries. And this, I think, is not just necessary for immediate political reasons to motivate sacrifice, but also because this helps to meet what has, of course, been universally recognized as a key problem when it comes to sacrifice in the struggle against climate change, which is generational. That we are asking the generations of today to make very real sacrifices to ward off dangers which, although they will kick in, as I say, begin to, long before younger people today are old, the truly dire physical effects will only kick in the further future. But of course, here, if you focus on patriotism, on attachment to, loyalty to existing nations, well then, by definition, you are concerned for the future of that nation after you yourself are dead. The notion of a temporary nation is ridiculous. As I think it's Milan Kundera said, human beings know that they are mortal, but they believe or like to believe that their nations have a certain immortality. And indeed, in terms of individual human lifetimes, they do. Many of our countries have existed for a very, very long time. The whole idea of patriotism and of service including, of course, military service, but service to the state more generally, is not just about preserving the state for the present generation, it is preserving it for the future. And that is also true, of course, of civic nationalism when it comes to the preservation of our democracies, something to which the American political system is explicitly dedicated, but Europe too. The European Union as an institution, but also our individual democratic states. We're not just trying to preserve these, until we're all dead. We are trying to preserve them for the future, for ourselves, but also, of course, as a model for humanity. So I believe that mobilizing nationalism, it is not the answer, but it is part of the answer to mobilizing populations for climate change action. Now, I should say that this in no way involves hostility on my part or opposition either to international agreements, Paris Agreement, obviously, or whatever we can manage in future, to international cooperation, absolutely not, or to international movements, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, Friends of the Earth, whatever. But, and here I speak once again as a realist, I think we have to recognize that these international agreements, these international movements are intended to get states to act. They're intended to push, embarrass, nudge, trap, if you will, states and state governments into taking action. Unfortunately, the United Nations has, the IPCC or Paris Agreement, have no executive powers themselves at all. And I have to say, if you look not just at the present government of China or Russia, but at India, or indeed the United States, it is extremely unlikely that the major emitters of the world will in fact sacrifice their real state powers to any international institutions. And I think COVID is also an example of the centrality of the state. Of course, it would have been vastly desirable if we had seen much more effective international cooperation. It is vastly desirable that Western states with reserves of vaccines make them available more widely to countries in the world that don't have them, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, as we saw throughout the world, in the end, it was only states that had the power to take many of the necessary actions in terms of lockdowns, vaccination campaigns, public awareness campaigns, closing of borders, and so on. So once again, speaking as a realist, the key question is how to get states, including our states, to act. And that is what my book is dedicated to trying, in a very small way, of course, to bring about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anatol, for that overview and for finishing really with on that point that it's about the mobilization, making states actually respond to a crisis and the mobilization of society. I mean, like you said, this is probably the important challenge that we are facing, at least our generation is facing, and the next generations are facing, and we are basically failing. And so that anything that can be done to mobilize action, and for, as you said, for radical solutions also to address the problem, it's really sort of interesting how you present the argument. So thank you for that. And I think I will move to Heather. I mean, Heather, I know that you have, as I was saying, an interest in climate change, that you've been looking at this also from an intergenerational perspective, but you've also been throughout your life a champion for democracy, for open societies, for freedom, for human rights, and many times these ideas, at least in Europe, maybe I think there's also maybe a difference of perception of what nationalism is in Europe and in the US. And Anatol, he didn't mention it today, but yeah, of course he mentioned patriotism, but there's also this idea of civic nationalism, not the ethno nationalism as you were saying. But in our debates, normally these ideas of democracy, human rights, and nationalism do not come together. Or if they are put together, they are normally sometimes in opposition. So, but my first question is, how do you react to Anatol's proposal? And yeah, please, Heather, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's really great to comment on such an interesting and book, and to engage with Anatol again. He's written on so many different subjects, and I'm very glad that he, like I, has come to the conclusion that after having worked on many other aspects of policy and current affairs, that climate change is actually the most important thing. And I think, to underline something he said right in the middle, that essentially many of the other, if not most of the other things we're currently worrying about become irrelevant when you consider the scale of the damage that climate change is bound to bring, even just on the current trajectory, let alone what could happen with regard to tipping points and feedback loops and so on. So I'm definitely sold on that point. I'd like to just give a couple of points following on from Anatol's approach, and also a couple of points of disagreement with him, because it would be very sad if we all just agreed. That would be terribly boring. And also to link a little bit to some of the work that Annika has been doing at EPC. So I think, first of all, it's a very welcome approach, because we need to look a lot more at the politics of climate change. The debate about climate policy has tended to be, certainly in Brussels at EU level, really quite focused on the technical part, which is very, very important. But it's meant that the political communication and discussion at political level, I mean, I don't mean the politicians, but politicians talking to voters about it, has been woefully behind that. And it's really important to focus on how to maintain democratic consent through what will be a long and turbulent transition. That transition is absolutely needed, and it's a system change. It's a change of our economies, a complete repricing of our economies, and it means a fundamental change in security paradigms, in even what is a definition of security in a burning world. And in order to get people there needs to be a very different kind of vocabulary and approach that we've seen. There's the need to prioritize climate, as Anatol said. At the moment, it's still just one policy among many. It's now discussed as a major priority in the European Union, which is good. This is a big change from just 2-3 years ago, when it was all about jobs and growth. But that change hasn't happened in the United States for some of the reasons that Anatol mentioned. And what's quite scary is that even in Europe, which is the first big mover as an advanced industrialized economy, it's still subject to all kinds of watering down of measures that need to be taken really quickly, and a lot of politicians who are still hoping that this is just going to be beyond their time frame. And time frames, I think, are one of the key problems, and which relate also to what Anatol was saying about nationalism. The problem with climate change for the past 30 years has been that it always seemed to be beyond not just the next electoral cycle, not just the next election, but the next couple of elections. So no politician was going to risk their political career giving very unpopular messages to the public and proposing radical measures to something that seemed like it could be, the next president but one's problem. And similarly, corporate profit cycles and reporting, and the way in which the whole corporate governance system works, accountability to shareholders and so on, also did not take into account something with such a long time horizon. It was about quarterly profits or annual results, rather than thinking about 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead. And as a result, we're now reaching emergency point, because neither the politics nor the economics has really fundamentally changed, and it needs to change very rapidly. So it's very important to have a book like this that looks at a now at least 1.5 century, 2 century old concept of nationalism, and how that can be brought in a positive frame, because we need to start thinking really seriously about how the politics of this are going to work. Otherwise, we will have gilets jaunes all over Europe, all over America, and many parts of the world. So I just wanted to start with a couple of points, and then I'll go into what I disagree with, but a couple of points of expansion on what Anatol was saying. That particularly this question of the impact of climate change on security, which is deeply underestimated. And he rightly pointed to the second order effects, and particularly he pointed to migration. But it's actually broader even than that, because environmental degradation really damages all systems, and even to our understanding of security itself. And we still see the way that security threats are basically regarded as exogenous risks, generated outside the EU and the US and other rich countries, rather than risks that the EU and US economic model and external policies have actually contributed to. You know, the EU's carbon emissions are only 8% of global carbon emissions. Sounds wonderful, pat on the back to the EU, and that's going to be reduced Fit for 55 by 55%, marvelous. But the EU's embedded CO2 in the products and services that it imports, the demand that its hyper-consumer economy and overconsumption creates is massively bigger. It's a much bigger proportion. I mean, there are all kinds of estimates of it, but some people even say 2/3 to 3/4. So it's really quite extraordinarily big. And also with regard to security, and this comes to a fundamental theme in Anatol's book, it's still very much dominated by national security frameworks. Now, the EU at least has a regionally coordinated approach. NATO has a regionally coordinated and transatlantic approach. But basically, you know, the defense establishments in each country are still thinking of here is us inside, and there's them over there. And they're focusing both on too much on how do we defend within our borders, and thinking about threats as being something that can be kept outside the borders. So it's the sort of homeland security approach, which doesn't work with climate because there's only one climate. But also, they're not taking account of the fact that decarbonisation alone is not going to stop the erosion of ecosystems and the ecological disintegration that's already starting to come from the never expanding use of energy and resources, really without limits. And that's a big problem. Carbon emissions could stop tomorrow, and we would still be facing ecological crises in a number of different parts of the world. Disruption to hydrological cycles, because of deforestation. These cause suffering, conflict, massive displacement of people. Just to give you a small example, and decarbonisation of the global north could actually increase deforestation of the global south. So if you think about the forests of Central Africa, which are basically responsible for the biophysics that feed the Nile, which of course provides water to millions of people, not just in Egypt, but also Uganda, to the Ethiopian highlands and so on. What happens when those forests are dug up to provide the lithium, cobalt, etc., the raw materials for electric vehicles and all the low carbon technologies that we want to bring in to decarbonize the global north? You know, you can create more disaster in other parts of the world through an ill thought out strategy, which is mostly focused just on creating nice, clean cities in Europe and the United States. So it's really important that the European Green Deal, which is basically designed for the EU's internal transition and not from the rest of the world, stops treating internal impacts as add-ons to the core climate policy, but really starts to see them as vital to the world system, and that includes security, because the other problem is that there is an extraordinary co-location of the deposits of minerals and other raw materials for low carbon technologies in highly fragile and conflict-prone zones. So we could make things a good deal worse. So there needs to be a systems approach to ecological security that's not fragmented along national or even regional borders, because neither ecological degradation nor its root causes stops at borders. And on this, I would just refer you to a publication that we did with Carnegie Europe, with Richard Youngs and Olivier Lazare, called The EU and Climate Security Towards Ecological Diplomacy, which sets out this wicked solution in more detail. So I'll just come on to a couple of, very briefly, a couple of points where I would just
disagree. Yep.
Yeah, different line from Anatol, which is really about the question of Russia and China, and also the language of sacrifice. So in Russia-China, I just note that disinformation will play a big role in the politics of climate change. And so let's not discount that the problems in the relationship with Russia are one thing, but Russian interference in our democracies is also going to affect climate. I mean, look what's happening now with manipulation of gas prices and so on. And also that Russia and China are not in the same position on climate. China is actually much more committed to action and has many more domestic drivers for effective climate action, whereas Russia is in a different story, again, completely different, that we won't go into now, but we could go into later. And final point is just on sacrifice. I would be really careful about this, because I genuinely think that if we get this transition right, there doesn't have to be massive sacrifice for most of the population, because individual behavioral change can happen to create some quite major changes in terms of our energy and also resource use, which doesn't mean a major sacrifice for individuals. It means some changes, but actually these can bring a better quality of life in terms of air quality, in terms of the building standards, also in mobility, not having to sit in traffic jams, not to face all of the pollution and so on. And Annika has done a lot of work on this at EPC, this question of individual behavioral change. What's needed is the social contract that Anatol referred to. It's the deal part of the European Green Deal, which is absolutely vital. So I would never advise a politician to frame it as sacrifice. It's change. But I also really think it's not hidden sacrifices. If the polluter pays and accountability sits where it should sit in terms of corporate governance and in terms of the state, it's actually quite possible to make that shift without having a lot of wir müssen Opfer bringen as the mentality behind it. And then I'm happy to come along to the questions about which elements of nationalism might be helpful and which unhelpful in our debate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather, for your reflections and for looking at this also in a constructive way, because I think there's also a lot of temptation to look at nationalism or national mobilization in a negative or with the potential negative spillovers, and you're looking at this, okay, how can we actually turn this into a positive? And you then referred also to a lot of the work that Annika has been doing in about sort of individual mobilization, and I know that she's been also thinking a lot about the sort of a plan on how to actually achieve the ambition. The Green Deal is really a very ambitious project. The transition is a very ambitious process, and Annika has been thinking about the foundations for action and for actually getting this thing done. So Annika, I would invite you now to share your reflections, I think maybe even on Anatol's and Heather's reflection so far. Thank you and welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to share some thoughts with the focus very much on Europe, the EU and its member states. And I would like to start by saying that I fully agree that nation states are essential actors in the transition. This transition can be accelerated or slowed down by member states. But while I'll talk about some of the challenges, the gaps in action, I want to start by stressing that in the global comparison, the EU with its member states have taken a leadership role in promoting the climate agenda. And while the member states do not always agree on the measures to be taken, the fact that the member states recognize together that the European Green Deal is the new growth strategy, this is significant. The fact that member states have agreed to achieve climate neutrality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, this sends a very important signal to the world where the EU is heading. But taking the urgency, we know that this is just a start, and while there's still a long way to go, and that there is still a long way to go to implement these goals. And when we look at the EU, we see that the EU and its member states tend to be good in agreeing on visions and setting targets, but as well summarized in the European Environment Agency's State of the European Environment report for 2020, our member states continuously fall behind when it comes to actually implementing the agreed climate, energy, environmental goals. And there's a problematic discrepancy between the EU level ambition and member state action. And we desperately, urgently need countries to take ownership for this agenda, to push through many of the required changes in our energy, mobility, in our food systems, and how we produce and consume. And the bigger driver for this should be self-interest, recognizing that it's in the country's national interest to find effective ways to prevent, mitigate, and adapt to climate change within their borders and beyond. What bothers me in the discussions across EU member states is that the rhetoric is not enough on what the benefits are for individual EU member states, be it the economic, social, environmental, security benefits. We barely hear our leaders talk about the costs of non-action. Rather, we see a lot of comparison on who does what. If our neighbors aren't doing more, be it within the EU or beyond, why should we? Also, just to say, I'll be happy to come back to climate change as a national security issue in the discussion if there's time, but more generally, recognizing that we're talking not about the potential, but about the real security threat that is already on our doorsteps, with the enormous cost for humanity, for our societies, for our economies, already during our lifetime, as well as series of benefits in the form of new better jobs, business opportunities, cleaner air, better health, lower healthcare costs, better quality of living, and ultimately sustainable prosperity. if we recognize this context, we should be seeing a race to the top. Countries, regions, cities, businesses competing with solutions and trying to beat one another in this ultimate race for better lives and prosperity within the boundaries that the planet has given us. And if we recognize this context, we should see a change in the narrative that we tell ourselves to realize that change is possible. It's a must and it's our self-interest. And we should celebrate the successes that we see around us, the developments, that the solutions that are making our economy, society, and lives more sustainable. And thus make this narrative, make it positive rather than a narrative of negative change. And if the EU and its member states can showcase the concrete economic, social, environmental, security benefits that come from reducing emissions and greening the economy, and how this can be done cost effectively, I would say that they can play a really leading role in mobilizing also others to speed up their efforts, which is also in our self-interest. But as a second point, I think that it's worth to recognize that while nation states are essential actors, it's not just national governments, state institutions, and electoral majorities that make the transition happen. In fact, many changes are happening even if not supported by member states. Many businesses and communities of businesses are driving change in our economies with the solutions they're bringing on the market. When international business screens its supply chains and operations, this can have a major impact. Even if the global EU, as well as national policy and financial frameworks at times send contradictory signals, we see that many businesses have recognized that greater sustainability is the future. They need to be prepared for this, and it's in their interest to be part of the solution. It's also interesting to see how several European cities have already taken the power in their hands, of which good example is how they're accelerating greening of mobility by introducing limits and bans on diesel and petrol cars. They're doing it because many of the member states have been very slow to take seriously the problems with air pollution and transport emission across the EU. And even though some member states now may fight against a recent Commission proposal to increase CO2 emission standards for vehicles and their efforts to accelerate uptake of clean vehicles, the cities have sent a clear message to automobile industry and their citizens what the future looks like. And of course, we shouldn't forget the citizens and consumers who can have a huge impact on the system. Basically, with every purchasing decision people make, they send a signal to the market. A good example of this is food consumption. People's interest in sustainable food has skyrocketed over the years. And as a result, so has the range of organic, vegetarian, vegan products that the food industry puts on the market. And although, and this is in the European context, we see the EU, the member states, we have common agriculture policy, common fisheries policy, they continue to provide enormous subsidies for unsustainable food production and consumption, which keeps the prices of these products artificially low. Even despite these discrepancies in action, the transition in the food system is already a reality. And lastly, while the actual implementation happens within the EU member states, I do want to finish off by recognizing the role of the EU institutions in guiding, coordinating, incentivizing, and enforcing action. Because the EU as a whole wouldn't be where it is today in addressing the climate, ecological, pollution, waste, and chemical crisis without EU collaboration, without coordination of efforts, without the agreed environmental climate goals and policies, without the diverse toolbox it has available, which is made of EU policies, economic and financial instruments, it's made of EU's convening power, which the EU can use and obviously should use even more in a coherent manner to guide and incentivize member states in action. Of course, I recognize that if there is a real political will and ownership in the member states, this will make compliance and implementation of agreed goals and rules easier and much, much more effective and efficient. And yes, the EU should become much better at ensuring compliance, enforcement, and penalizing member states when they are breaking agreed rules. But even when member states fail or are slow to implement EU's environmental and climate goals and policies, the EU targets, together with the policy and economic framework, provide essential framework and incentives for action. So I'll stop here. And as I said, if there's time, I'm happy to reflect more on climate change as a national security issue, as well as on what is needed next if we're to get on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika, for that also for bringing the EU perspective and how the EU through its tools can actually then also push member states and countries to act. I think it was clear from the three presentations that both, within the EU, but globally, we are falling short of the challenge. And so I wanted to invite again our participants to, I think they're being a little bit shy today, but to write their questions in the chat or to raise their hands. But I wanted just to really to touch upon this issue of nationalism and more of the mobilization. And I went to look at and looking more sort of at the EU level. And I went to look at the spring Eurobarometer. So the field work was from June and July 2021 on the two most important issues facing the EU. So for the respondents, for European respondents, the two major issues for the EU were economic situation and environment and climate change. So climate change has moved from the winter Eurobarometer to the spring Eurobarometer again to second position. Interestingly enough, within the countries, so when they asked what is the two major issues within your country, climate change drops to number 5. So my question is that how do you read these results? If the issue is about mobilization, clearly people, there are 4 countries, the Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany and Belgium that actually think that this is their major problem within the country, but this is not. This is not across the whole EU. So, what is your reaction to these numbers in terms of the mobilization? How can we mobilize this civil society to this? Heather, you had raised your hand, but I don't know if go ahead, and then I'll bring Anatol and Annika, please.
Well, I think this is an incredibly important point because there is a dangerous assumption among politicians across Europe at the moment that relatively high levels of support for the general idea, the general principle of climate action, even radical climate action, is high. That is true. In aggregate, it's high. And across the European Union, that's a good thing. But it's fragile, it's shallow, and it's very much segmented by age and across countries. So, and that you need to dig further. But Eurobarometer just gives the broad picture. Now, we've done research with DPART, a democratic participation think tank in Berlin, and also with Counterpoint in Paris, looking in more detail at what's going on. And it's much more fragile than it looks. One thing is, it's only really the under 25s who want seriously radical action. They don't own houses and cars yet. And they also understand this is going to affect them in their lifetimes in not very far away. And they are prepared to go for the whole way on Fit for 55 and beyond. But in other countries, in other cohorts, in other people who are older, it's a very different story. They don't yet know, and because there hasn't been a social contract provided to them, they don't know what it means, for example, to give up the internal combustion engine. Does that mean I'll be able to afford an electric car? Will I be able to get to my workplace if there's no public transport available? This was at the heart of the Gilets jaunes protest to begin with. They're told energy transition, you've got to get out of fossil fuels. Okay, but then where's the infrastructure for me to connect my house to an electrical grid? Who's going to buy solar panels for me and my neighborhood? None of these things have been spelled out yet, and it's very important the EU is taking these measures with the Fit for 55, with the renovation wave and so on, as people start to see the benefits. But there needs to be a lot more reaching people in the local communities, also through business, as Annika was saying, so that they see the way that they can live. There needs to be a vision of the future life in a carbon neutral or climate neutral economy and society, and a sense of what it will actually be like. And so this is very different from 1989, when people were faced with a massive system change, the end of everything they'd known in terms of economy and politics. But they could peep over the Berlin Wall and see how people lived in a different system and imagine how they might live in that different system. And even if it didn't quite work out exactly like that, there was a sense of, look, there's prosperity, there's stability, there's security. Whereas now we have no model society that has made it to climate neutrality, which can provide that example. And that's where nationalism is quite tricky, because it's easy for those who don't want to provide a vision or to decry the vision and be cynical about the vision to say, well, you're going to have to live like in China and live under authoritarianism, because that's the only way you'll be able to get to the kind of measures that will be needed. Or once you've started nationalism, there's no on-off button. It's very difficult and so it's again very easy to start framing these things as external threats, as things that are being imposed upon you. This is imposed upon you by Brussels. Look at how the far right in France is using this in the French election campaign already. Look at how the AfD used that in the German election campaign. Look also at what Viktor Orban said yesterday about this is yet another diktat from Brussels. So I think there is a real danger that nationalism, particularly in Europe, and Anatol referred to how in the US, the sort of China rivalry is a form of nationalism that can be very damaging to climate action. In Europe, there's a real danger that it becomes another diktat from Brussels and must be resisted, rather than we are all heading towards a different future that could actually be a better quality of life.
Thank you, Heather. Anatol, your take.
Yes. Well, I agree that in future, I mean, the end state, if we can achieve it, of a low or zero carbon, green economy, coupled, of course, with Green New Deal and social solidarity, would be better for everybody. But the transition to that could be very bumpy indeed. One thinks of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. The end result of the transition from, very poor agricultural, semi-feudal European societies to modern European industrial societies ended up being better for, of course, the overwhelming majority of populations. The process of the transition, of course, involved mass suffering, colossal disruption, revolutions, and arguably, indirectly, the First and Second World Wars as well. And now, of course, I'm not saying that, pray God, it will be anything as bad as that. But it is very difficult, for me at least, to see how we will be able to push peoples and economies in the direction we want them to go without higher prices, carbon taxing to drive up in one way or another the price of fossil fuels. But as we see from the present, so far only potential gas crisis in Europe and the surge in prices, in fact, whenever prices really, really go up, governments react with what? With new subsidies to bring prices down, rather than saying, great, this is exactly what we need in order to, help really push economies towards abandonment of fossil fuels. The other point, of course, is that most unfortunately, alternative energy, not renewable energy, is not yet in a position, in part for, of course, pure technological, brutal physical reasons, to replace fully fossil fuels. And here, if you take the German Greens in particular, but other Greens as well, part of the sacrifice that, in my view, will have to be made, but David Wallace-Wells and others have made this point as well, is a certain very limited sacrifice of personal safety. Namely, you've got to stick with nuclear energy until alternative energy is in a position to take up the slack. A key reason why Germany is failing, and failing badly to meet its Paris Agreement commitments, is this panicky abandonment of nuclear energy as a result of the Fukushima. Well, it wasn't actually a nuclear accident, it was an earthquake and a tsunami, and they don't have earthquakes and tsunamis in Germany. When I hear leading Greens in Germany talking about how, there's been this terrible German sacrifice because you can't eat wild boar in certain parts of Germany, although since I'm speaking to a Belgian and French audience, apparently you'd need to eat as much wild boar as Obelix the Gaul in order to put yourself in serious danger. One does have to recognize that here too there is a certain failure of seriousness and a failure to assess comparative risks and a failure to sacrifice, amongst other things, also your inherited attitudes, when it comes to meeting the challenge of climate change. So certainly I entirely agree with Heather. We need to also focus people's attention on a very good end state, but I wouldn't obviously start out by exaggerating sacrifices, but I fear, and I do think that well, the opinion polls that have been mentioned do indicate that without explaining to people how some sacrifices will be necessary, you will in fact play into the hands of the climate change denial or opposition camp, who will exaggerate the sacrifices and use this as as an argument against action. I mean, as far as nationalism is concerned, and of course I'm deeply aware of the problem across Europe in terms of the mobilization of nationalism, against climate change action. But the melancholy fact is that nationalism is there. Of course, thank God, not as bad in most of Europe, at least sort of Western Europe, as it is in the United States, but it is there and it's not going to go away. And the question is how we can, if you like, point it in a better direction as far as climate change is concerned, but also I would say more widely, because of course my entire book is dedicated to precisely saying that the classical exogenous threats are not so grave. And something I say in the book, and I've said it again and again, is that our security elites risk making the mistake of our forefathers before 1914. They thought that the greatest threat to their states and regimes were each other. Russia the greatest threat to Germany, Germany the greatest threat to France, and so forth. Of course, in fact, the greatest threats were endogamous. They were threats stemming from the tensions, the fissures, the sufferings of your internal problems of European populations, which the First World War released in the form of communism and Nazism with dreadful results.
Thank you, Anatol. Annika, I don't know if you want to comment on this, because there's already the shyness in the chat room is over. So there's already four sort of interesting questions that relate to some of the issues that we've touched upon. So I don't know if you want to address, respond to any of this, or can I bring one of the questions that relates to what was being said?
Or I can try to group my answers together as well.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I wanted to, because there's four questions. I'm going to try to take the four of them, but this one is very much linked to what you were saying just a few minutes ago, Anatol, which is mobilization of nationalism, but how? How are we going to? John Craigs is asking, how can you actually mobilize nationalism to concretely convince people to make climate positive choices? Basically, it's his question. How can we actually mobilize it? How can we operationalize this?
Well, I mean, draw attention to the existential future threats, to the future existence of specific countries. Just focus people on that. America, wherever, is not going to be around in 150 years if we continue on our existing trajectories. This is true of America, but as I say, also, I mean, European democracies as well. The entire idea of us representing democracy and human rights in the world, even if our states survive, they will not survive as democracies in the face of radical climate change, and our entire cultural identity and image will disappear. That's the first thing. But the second thing, in the short to medium term, I'm afraid, and I regard this as objectively true, but it is also the biggest indirect the factor on the right in Europe. I mean, we cannot afford to neglect the issue of migration. If you look at what is happening in Western Africa, in Central America, potentially in South Asia as well. Incidentally, we always see this as a Western issue. The most savage anti-immigrant border in the world, more than 1,100 people shot dead over the past decade, is the Indian border against Bangladesh. because not just of course, Modi's Hindu nationalist government, but previous Congress governments as well, are acutely worried about Bangladeshi migration and are also acutely worried about the effects of climate change on Bangladesh. So migrate, and once look at how people in South Africa, other places regard migration from their neighbors. This is not just a Western issue, and it is the biggest indirect effect of climate change, I think, as far as we're concerned, in the short to medium term, that is to say within the next few decades.
Thank you, Anatol. We'll come back to the issue of migration because there's a question also in the chat on migration, but I wanted to go to Annika. Concretely, how can we mobilize nationalism? I know what would be your take on this, and then Heather, maybe she will have also want to contribute on this one. But Annika, please.
And yeah, I'll be happy to come back to the whole question around reaching people, because I think that there are several issues we need to do. If we recognize that this is the ultimate challenge, the ultimate threat to our societies, economies, to our security, what we should be seeing is that we have leadership that recognizes and communicates the urgency for action. And these leaders, they can be politicians, policymakers, media, heads of military, other opinion influences. And at least this is obviously the case for Europe, but obviously elsewhere as well. We need leaders that communicate very clearly what is the direction of travel, the costs of non-action, and the benefits of the green transition. And in the case of Europe, in the EU, there's so much more that still needs to be done to actually align the member state action with the set goals. We still have a lot of incoherencies, be it with the use of policies as well as the economic tools we use. So it's actually very easy to say, first of all, let's remove subsidies for harmful practices. Second, invest in the future we want. And when we look at, for example, at the moment, there is a significant amount of public money that is being made available as part of the COVID recovery efforts. This is a real opportunity to invest in the transition and leverage private support for this aim and actually help to address some of these challenges that we will have in getting to the transition and getting on the right track. And this social dimension is so important. It's in member states' interest to bring people along. And if we really are to achieve the agreed goals, we need to communicate and show the benefits that the measures taken will bring for people. We need dialogue. We need participatory efforts where we engage with the people. We understand what their fears and concerns are so that we can address them and that we manage the social impacts, especially on the most vulnerable. And as a last element in here, we need to provide people with tools to engage in the transition. And also we need to find ways to encourage behavioral change. And here I would think that it's actually important to keep in mind that it's not only the state can be an influential messenger, it's good to keep in mind that behavioral scientists recognize that messengers, the influential messengers, differ for different people. Parents can be more influenced by the concerns and fears of their children than the political statements of national leaders. In a similar way, consumer choices can be greatly influenced by one's peer group. So we need to keep this complexity in mind if we are to involve people. And yes, I'll stop here, but if there's time, still happy to come back on the
Annika.
security issues.
Yeah, I'll come now. Heather, any point on this in terms of how to operationalize then nationalism to make this happen?
Yes, absolutely. And I can also come to one of the questions in the chat about the security threat related to this. So I think, first of all, we've got to be really careful about what kind of nationalism. I mean, there's the civic versus ethnic nationalism, but it's also about whether you are putting people on a state of high alert in terms of threats. Okay, so there's nationalism in the sense of belonging, and wanting to preserve national heritage, national culture, what we're proud of, what we love about our country and our culture. That's all very positive. But the danger is that once you start talking about nationalism in terms of protecting national security against foreigners, against foreign threats, which is a lot of what's going on in the United States, then you reinforce a mindset of high alert, a sense of insecurity and fear of material deprivation. And what political psychology shows very clearly is once people are in that kind of fear mindset, they can think about nothing else. If they're afraid that the danger is, as Anatol was saying, is coming from outside, the danger is migrants coming from other countries, then they'll want to build that wall. I mean, that was used rather successfully and to gain many votes in the United States. And so then you might get a short-term spike of solidarity, but only for the in-group. and you reinforce the in-group, out-group separation that political psychologists say is absolutely key. And that lowers people's openness to others and their sense of solidarity globally. And there is only one climate. So it's really important that the frame used to describe it in terms of the national nation state is about belonging and heritage. And especially it's about freedoms. Now, the freedoms agenda is at real risk of being hijacked by the AfD, who've been arguing that Annalena Baerbock wants to take away Germans' freedoms. And that was fortunately struck down, that argument, by the German Constitutional Court, which in an extraordinary ruling earlier this year said that the German climate law needed to be tougher, not weaker, because it was denying future generations of Germans their freedoms in order to preserve the freedoms of Germans now. So the costs of inaction, which Annika was referring to as essential for politicians to address, needs to include this freedoms argument in a very positive way, that for our nation, for our people, they will lack freedom if we don't take action in this way. It's not the hordes who are going to come and invade us who are the problem. It is the climate itself. And that's where, to come to the security question that Kadri Tasten asked in the chat as well, this is about how security itself is understood, that climate is going to cause developments that threaten everybody's freedoms. But if you can include economic and social rights as part of the concept of human security, if you could bring in the idea that security involves sustained and stable access to habitable space for everybody, then you make territorial security and borders less relevant, because you consider a whole of society security with respect to climate. And that's where you've got to get to. You've got to get to this idea of, this is about meeting essential human needs. And that's what our economic system and our economic policy needs to aim at. And that's also what security policy is about. If it's about us versus them, we get more than they do, win, lose, totally zero sum, then it's really going to be a disaster to start on nationalism. It's a different kind of concept of nationalism that needs to go with a different concept of security.
Thank you, Heather, for those remarks and for bringing Kadri Tasten's question, which is that she was saying that there is a lot of focus on migration and not, but what are other security implications? Annika, I know that you need to leave in 2 minutes, so I'll go to you first and then move on to Anatol. I mean, there were a lot of interesting questions in the chat, but I think we have basically 4 minutes to go. So Annika.
Yeah, I would like to just summarize. I think that when we're talking about the security dimension, I think there are two dimensions. And this also builds on what Anatol was saying. If countries fail to recognize the impacts of climate change on different parts of the world, they risk focusing on security threats that may not be actual risks at all. And the reality is that we're looking at military forces across the world already today. We see that they're increasingly needed to manage climate-induced catastrophes. We saw this in China over the summer, and we are going to be seeing this increasingly across the world, where actually our military forces will be occupied to deal with climate-related disasters. And it is this new enemy that will be keeping our military forces increasingly busy in managing floods, disaster relief, firefighting, dislocated populations, etc. So I think that's one dimension we need to keep in mind. The other one is that it's time to recognize that we are in a war. The war has started. We spent billions on buying Hornets and investing in military to deter possible military threats and defend ourselves against worst case scenarios, no questions asked. But if we listen to science, we know that we are at the moment in a war against time, against climate change, ecological destruction. And this is not a traditional enemy. This is a shared enemy across the globe, which threatens our national and international security. And we need this recognition that we are in a war. There's this urgent to act. And unfortunately, this is not currently being reflected in the measures that are taken.
Okay, thank you very much, Annika, for that, and also for being so forceful. I know that this is your passion as well, so it's always good that emotion comes into policy debates as well, and that we really look at this from this perspective. Anatol, I mean, Felix had also a really interesting question. It was also very nice because he was saying that the conversation is so good that's why there are no questions. But he has also this issue about international collaboration among countries that have national values that are different. So I mean, the security element, the aspect, and also this other element of collaboration among different national identities and national values.
Oh, first of all, I'd just like to say, since she has to go, thank you so much to Annika for taking part, and also I would also say for the passion of your commitment to this issue, which of course I totally approve of and share. On security, I mean, part of it is, you know, what has been called human security. I mean, I really think, you know, we need to focus our minds and the minds of our security establishments on the fact that in the end, they are there to protect the lives and well-being of our citizens, you know, of people, and people are dying, people are getting sick, people are losing their homes, people are being, you know, endangered already by the effects of climate change in our countries, you know, in a way that, you know, I mean, yes, of course, China and Russia pose certain kinds of threats, but, you know, I mean, through carbon gas emissions, sure, but I mean, on that we are all guilty, right? But it isn't China and Russia, you know, which are desertifying the Mediterranean or creating wildfires or heat waves or any of these things. You know, it is emissions which we have to deal with. So human security is one aspect. On the future role of the military, yes, I mean, I believe that the most important Western military unit today is the American Army Corps of Engineers, which, by the way, its traditional role has always been flood control and water management, and that is going to become more and more and more important. And I mean, in Europe too, we need to think of, you know, rethink our militaries as disaster relief and disaster management organizations. And once again, not just for us, but, you know, as we already see to an extent, but much, much more intensively and widely internationally as well, you know, just as we have sent out people in a chaotic way, but with at least provisional success, you know, to confront Ebola in Africa. So we need to think of, you know, how we can use our militaries, who can, after all, be deployed quickly and in a disciplined fashion, but much more intensively in the area of disaster relief and climate resilience elsewhere in the world. But, you know, when it comes to migration and wars, look, I mean, it's no good saying that climate change threatens, you know, ecological catastrophe, social meltdown, state failure, and civil war across large parts of the world, and then saying, oh, but migration isn't really an issue. It is an issue. And there are going to be higher and higher wars. There is no question about that. The point, though, is that, of course, this has to be combined with much, much more intensive efforts to help and strengthen key areas of the world. But in order to do that, look, I mean, let's face it, I mean, America is particularly bad, but European aid efforts, you know, I've been closely involved in this in South Asia, but in Western Africa as well, compared to the scale of the problems, are pitiful. I mean, simply pitiful. And yet you see deep public unwillingness significantly to increase these efforts. So I mean, I'm afraid, once again, to get people really, really to increase aid, development aid, resilience aid to parts of the world, you've got to convince them that these parts of the world are indirectly also a threat to them. I mean, I know this, you know, this is an unpopular line, and it's one I came to myself unwillingly, but I'm afraid, you know, I mean, once again, it's particularly true of America, but look at the sums, look at the taxes that people are prepared to pay for Western militaries, which to a very considerable extent have no useful purpose whatsoever in, you know, many sectors. And then look at the sacrifices which so far they've been prepared to make either for international aid or the struggle against climate change. I'm afraid that threat perception, like it or not, is simply a prime mover of human effort. And once again, the task must be to convince people that climate change really is a threat. Once again, not just to the planet, it is, to humanity it is, but to them and their children.
Thank you, Anatol, for that last reflection. listen, I think we could, easily say for another hour, sort of just unpacking all of the ideas and all of the issues that you but also Heather and Annika brought to the table. Last 2 points on my side. First, an apology to all the participants to whose question I was not able to bring into the discussion. Thank you for participating and for being there. And finally, it remains for me to thank you both and Annika as well. Annika has had to leave, but to thank you, Heather, and thank you, Anatol, for bringing it's such an interesting discussion. I think we're going to have more of this, but clearly today was really a stellar 80 minutes of conversation about what will be a life-changing transition, I think, for all of us. So I hope that we are up to the task, and that in a few years we will be able to look back and say that we are able to mobilize people through whatever methods were there to mobilize them and to tackle this challenge. So again, thank you very much for taking the time to spend these 80 minutes with us, both Annika, Adder, and you, Anatol, but also all the participants. And thank you also for the King Budman Foundation and for all the colleagues that made this seminar today possible. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
It was a great pleasure, and thank you, Heather, for